My name's Quentin Peel, and I'm your moderator today. I'm an associate fellow at Chatham House, former foreign editor at the Financial Times, and most importantly, a member of the Dahrendorf committee that supports this forum. As I'm sure most of you know, the Dahrendorf Forum is a collaborative project between the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin and LSE Ideas, the think tank attached to the London School of Economics. And it's been supported in recent years with generous finance from the Mercator Foundation. Anyway, this is the second in a series of 3 debates on the great questions of our times and the future of the liberal order, hosted by the Dahrendorf Forum to mark 10 years of its existence. And today's subject is perhaps the most urgently relevant. How can the global economy cope with the pandemic? But as I'm sure we're going to discover, the crisis may be with us right now, but the questions it raises fit very much into the great questions of our times. The pandemic is not just a huge challenge as a source of great uncertainty and a massive disruption of our daily lives, but an opportunity to rethink the future of our global economy, liberal democracy, and the international economic order. And we've got just an hour to do so, so we better get on. We've been invited to pose and explore these questions in the spirit of Ralph Dahrendorf, sociologist, former director of the LSE, warden of St Antony's College, Oxford, a junior foreign minister in the German federal government back in the 1960s, a European commissioner in Brussels in the 1970s, and above all, a provocative thinker. He famously wrote that intellectuals, as the court jesters of modern society, have the duty to doubt everything that is obvious, to make relative all authority, and to ask all those questions that no one else dares to ask. Well, all our speakers here today are intellectuals who are more than capable of performing those functions, and I will encourage them to do so. Professor Iain Begg is academic co-director of the Dahrendorf Forum, alongside Helmut Unheier in Berlin. He's a professorial research fellow at the European Institute of the LSE, whose main research work is on the political economy of European integration and EU economic governance. His focus is on the implications of the COVID-19 economic crisis for global governance. Sir Howard Davies was, like Ralph Dahrendorf, a former director of the LSE. He's had an extraordinary career, including being Director General of the Confederation of British Industry, Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, Chairman of the Financial Services Authority, and Chair of the UK Airports Commission. Today, he's chairman of the Natwest Group, formerly the Royal Bank of Scotland. He's also professor of practice at Sciences Po in Paris, which sounds intriguing. Howard, maybe you can tell us later what it involves. The question he'll seek to answer is, how will the economic consequences of the coronavirus pandemic affect the financial system? And no one's better placed to answer that. And finally, last but certainly not least, Professor Linda Yueh is visiting professor at LSE Ideas and chair of the LSE Economic Diplomacy Commission. She's also a fellow in economics at St Edmund Hall, Oxford, and adjunct professor at the London Business School. She's a qualified lawyer as well as an economist and a former journalist and broadcaster. She's just been appointed as well as an advisor to the UK Board of Trade, although her name has aroused rather less controversy than that of Tony Abbott, the former Australian Prime Minister, who was on the same list. Linda's Dahrendorf reflection piece asks, can we rebuild the economic consensus? And she's drawing on her latest book, The Great Economists, How Their Ideas Can Help Us Today, which was a Best Business Book of the Year selected by The Times and by Newsweek magazine. Papers by all 3 of our panelists are already available online in a new transdisciplinary journal called Global Perspectives, with an introduction by Helmut Unheier. But here, you get it live, and you can debate the issues with the speakers. Very briefly, Kenneth Rogoff of Harvard University calls this the uncertainty pandemic, and he warns that the insecurity will weigh on the global economy long after the worst is past. Well, the good news is that we could have at least 2 first-generation vaccines ready by the end of the year. although it may well take another year to get them distributed just to rich country citizens. The poor will almost certainly have to wait longer. The bad news is that so far we've seen an alarming lack of global solidarity in dealing with it, not perhaps unrelated to the lack of US leadership and a trade conflict between the two largest economies, the US and China, undermining efforts at cooperation. Is this the moment when Europe should step up to the plate and take the lead? Iain Begg, over to you.
Thank you very much, Quentin, and thank you to everybody else for coming along to listen to this. I'm going to try first to detail the nature of the economic crisis resulting from COVID-19. To me, it falls under three main headings. The first is macroeconomic. We're all aware of the sharp fall in GDP, the likelihood that most advanced countries will fail to come back to their pre-COVID GDP levels until perhaps 2023 or 2024, and the consequences of that for the way economies are run. The second effect is sectoral. Some sectors are being hit far more decisively than others. Think of tourism, travel, many of the leisure activities which underpin large service sector economies like the UK or France, to a lesser extent Germany. And the third effect is the effect on jobs, resulting in a loss of household income. From the first effect, macroeconomics, we know there's going to be a much bigger public debt. Governments have been spending furiously. There is a risk that this leads to some financial instability, which I think Howard is going to elaborate on subsequently. From the sectoral effects, we can anticipate corporate failures and some fragility in markets. And from the loss of jobs and income, there's going to be some rise in poverty and quite possibly an erosion of the employability of many workers. These are all short-term effects, but they feed into longer-term effects, which we can think of as the legacy of COVID-19, the uncertainty that Quentin just mentioned, that Ken Rogoff had identified, and I would highlight two such long-term effects. One, on the macroeconomic side, is macroprudential tensions, the concern that public sector deficits will interact with what's going on in the real economy to create an unstable position. And on the supply side, we can expect to see economic scarring. Those who've been worst affected by the crisis will take a long time to recover from it. We know this from previous crises or recessions. Those who are made redundant or lose their jobs don't easily come back. And economic scarring will also have an effect on companies. They too will be scarred. And this leads to a number of challenges. Challenges for global governance, challenges for local governance. The first is, as we learn almost daily, the health crisis is far from resolved. We see new surges in many countries, and even Boris Johnson's latest attempts to believe that he can insulate the UK from it seem to be falling apart as we see a surge in this country. We know that the economic crisis is with us, but it has an uncertain magnitude, and the duration is very hard to predict. If you read any forecasts that say it will be ended by the 25th of January 2021, do not believe them. These are scenarios, not credible forecasts. What we've seen is varied national responses. In some cases, very significant attempts have been made to cushion the impact of the downturn. Because remember one thing, the downturn is the result of deliberate policy actions. It's unusual compared with previous financial crises, which have normally been unexpected and therefore lead governments to try to rush to deal with it. But now the cushioning has to give way to re-stimulating the economy. This has been made much easier by the fact that central banks were very quick to react and have continued to pump money into the system through various devices such as quantitative easing. What we observe in this is that European countries generally and Japan have created the largest stimulus packages. This is in contrast to what happened a decade ago when it was China and other East Asian countries which were the principal stimulators, and Europe lagged very much behind. In addition, what we see in Europe is, for the first time, an attempt by the EU level, separately from the member states, to complement what the national level is doing with a vast package going under the heading of Next Generation EU. And it's worth recalling, for those of you who are not familiar with the detail here, that the G20 is in fact 19 countries, plus the EU as a member in its own right. Beside what the individual countries and the European authorities are doing, the IMF is going to have a vital role if matters deteriorate, because already more than 100 countries have applied for emergency loans, and if things get worse in lower income countries, we can expect this to accelerate. In parallel, there's going to be a massive need for cooperation and also for burden sharing. Quentin mentioned vaccines. Who's going to pay for the vaccines? Who's going to get the vaccines? These are vital questions of governance. For Europe, I would say this is an opportunity. For once, it has the chance to lead, in stark contrast to, as I said, to what happened a decade ago. This is reinforced by US reticence and his hostility to the rest of the world, but also a suspicion of China's motives in what China does. Just look at some of the reactions to China sending protective equipment to certain countries, and they think, well, why are they doing this? That said, the EU recovery plan needs to work. It has to be implemented convincingly. It has to avoid the usual delay and procrastination that occurs in anything that's done by the European level. The EU is also here as a supporter of the multilateral approach. And I think it's revealing that the EU is in the lead in trying to resist the damage to the multilateral approach being wrought by the Americans. So I'll end with a simple rhetorical question, a big question. Can Europe succeed? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iain. That certainly sets us up very nicely. Howard, you've written a masterly summary of the challenges facing the financial sector, beginning with the huge accumulation of debt, of public debt and private debt, and the uncertainty about whether that debt can be managed. You divide the challenges into the certainties, the probabilities, and the great unknowns. Now, tell us about them and tell us whether perhaps then come back to Iain's thesis that this may be the moment for Europe to show the leadership. But how do you analyse the way ahead?
Yes, thanks, Quentin. As you say, I adopted a very straightforward taxonomy in the paper. I'm not naive enough or vain enough to think that everybody listening will have read it. So as I just quickly skip through what's happened since, I will try very briefly to summarise what I said. In the certainties, I said, and Iain supported this, that there would be a massive increase in government debt and also in private sector debt as governments pushed out loans in order to keep companies in being through the crisis in the hope that they could bridge across a V-shaped recession. All that has certainly happened and happened in spades, probably larger amounts than was expected at Natwest Bank, for example. We put out small business loans in 6 weeks in April and May, equivalent to our annual normal flow of small business loans. That, I said, would probably be followed by the need for greater equity financing, possibly some of it provided by governments. There, we have not seen much progress so far. In the UK, the government's not keen on that idea, but certainly we have not seen the emergence of new flows of equity, which I think will be needed to replace that debt. So that's a big problem which I see looming on the horizon. On the probabilities, I said that I thought that the banking system was a lot more robust going into this crisis than it had been the last time, and that this would not quickly turn into a banking crisis. And furthermore, that banks and governments would this time work together rather than in conflict as they were in 2008, 2009. And I think that's turned out to be correct. We haven't yet seen any bank failures, even though the economy has tumbled into quite a deep recession in all developed countries. I also suggested, however, that it would be the trigger for some consolidation in the banking system, and we are now starting to see that. certainly in places like Italy and Spain, we are already seeing some consolidation, and I think that will go on because, frankly, there are too many banks in Europe, and most of them are not making any money. I then suggested one or two other things which are perhaps slightly aside from this discussion today, that this would stimulate a further fall in the usage of cash, and furthermore that central banks would accelerate the development of their own digital currencies. And we've seen signs of that already. I then moved on to the big unknowns. And I think I'll focus really on two of them. One is the question of whether all of this will be followed by inflation. Because if you look back at previous episodes where governments have taken on massively increased debt burdens, they have floated off those eventually by a combination of things. After the Second World War, by more rapid growth combined with a bit of inflation, which gradually whittled away the scale of the debt burden as a percentage of GDP. It's a little bit difficult to see why that should happen. I don't find anybody forecasting an acceleration of growth, certainly not in the developed countries, which then leaves you with the possibility of austerity. Well, we tried that after the last crisis. There's not much market for that, certainly in the UK, and I don't identify much market for it in Europe or the US. So the idea of governments running significant surpluses, I think, is pretty unlikely, which lastly leaves you some form of financial repression with interest rates held down to very low levels for a long, long time, possibly combined with inflation. Since then, I think that the odds on inflation have gone up somewhat because if we look in the market expectations of inflation in 5 years' time have gone up quite significantly, still not to extravagant levels, but from about 0.2 or 0.3% inflation, which was what people were expecting in March or April, to now about 1.5%. And secondly, we've seen the Fed, the first of the central banks to produce the results of a major rethink on monetary policy, confirming that in the future, the Fed would seek to catch up inflation shortfalls against its target by allowing inflation to overshoot subsequently. We await the results of a parallel review by the ECB and indeed another one by the Bank of England, but I think it would be surprising if they did not come out with some similar language. So the central banks are telling us that they will tolerate higher inflation in the future. Now, of course, people would say, well, that's fine, but they haven't been able to achieve their inflation targets in recent years, so how will they allow that to happen? But in an environment in which there is a vast amount of debt put out by governments and indeed by companies, eventually that may well feed through into greater inflation. So my feeling is that inflation is now somewhat more likely than I thought it was when I wrote the paper in May. The last point that I made then, and I think needs some further articulation now, is what all this means for global governance. Now, if you look back at the last financial crisis, you saw a boost, if you like, in global cooperation and collaboration. Some of it stimulated, in fact, by Gordon Brown, who convened, and indeed by George W. Bush, who convened a G20 summit. Gordon Brown convened another one, and there was a significant coming together of countries to reform the financial system, and a major wave of the re-regulation of the global financial system involving much higher capital for banks and lots of other things. And that was a pretty successful exercise, and goes back to my first point, that this hasn't turned into a banking crisis because the banks were much better capitalized at the outset. Now, this time, we've not seen that. We have not seen big G20 summits, of course, some of that for reasons to do with the coronavirus itself. But it's been very difficult, as you, Quentin, said in your introduction, to identify any real commonality of purpose in the global community about the future. Now, you can argue that that has been less necessary because actually the framework put in place after the last crisis has gone reasonably well. Countries have been able to maintain regulatory discipline. They've used the macroprudential flexibility quite effectively. They've taken off capital buffers. The system has worked as intended, I would argue. But looking forward, I think we can start to see the emergence of tensions which will require international collaboration. And the big question is, will they get them? The most obvious one, of course, is what's been going on in the currency markets, where the dollar has been falling quite sharply, tiny bit of recovery in the last couple of days, but has fallen quite a lot against the euro. And that is going to start to put pressure on the Eurozone and indeed on the UK, where the dollar has gone down quite considerably against sterling as well. And these international tensions, which risk becoming beggar your neighbour policies, will, I think, require some coming together and some understanding about just how the pains and pressures of this epidemic can be managed globally. And that, I think, is the area of greatest concern, that there simply isn't the understanding between countries at this point, which will allow us to manage the tensions that the offsets to the crisis and the recovery phase from the crisis will generate.
Thank you, Howard, very much. That's excellent. Can I just throw in one question before I move to Linda? And that is to get a first answer out of you as whether you think there is a chance in this rather worrying situation of a lack of international coordination for actually the European Union, with its quite surprisingly large promises of intervention, to take the lead as Iain was suggesting.
Well, I think it's possible. I mean, the agreement on an internal package, if you like, has been very promising. But I'm afraid that still it's difficult to know who will really lead from Europe, because we don't see very strong governments with a very strong commitment as yet. So in theory, yes, but I'm slightly doubtful about it in the short term.
Okay, well, perhaps we'll come back to that. I want to move now to Linda.
Delighted to be here on this massively important discussion. And I think, I will answer your question as well as the general one for this session and tie it into my latest article, which is, can we rebuild the economic consensus? I think just a moment on the backdrop to it. It's from my latest book, The Great Economists, How Their Ideas Can Help Us Today, which looks at 250 years of economic history. So I'm not going to do 250 years of economic history in 5 minutes, but what I do want to point out is there are periods in history, and I'll go through this in a moment, in which the consensus around multilateralism or around the status quo, the current economic system, it breaks down. And it gets rebuilt. So can the global economy cope with this pandemic? I think one of the aspects of coping with it is the importance of multilateralism, which has already been mentioned by both Howard and Iain, and cooperation on a global scale. So again, because I'm taking a rather more historical perspective, I would probably say that the breakdown in consensus around this economic system, the backlash against globalization, the discontent with the high levels of inequality predates the pandemic. And it had to do, of course, with the banking crash from a decade ago, but not just that. A lot of this discontent had been building for even longer, possibly dating to the last consensus which the world seemed to have gotten to largely, which was at the end of the Cold War, in which it seemed the USSR, with its command economy and central planning, was not the system that the consensus was centered on. Instead, it was on the market economy reformed. And so that period of the 1990s was when there was a consensus. And then it seemed by the end of that decade, the consensus was again breaking down. So if you recall the backlash against globalization, the protests at the WTO, all of those things were pointing to a frame, again, of what we all think the economic system should be. So coming to the present day a bit, in terms of rebuilding this consensus, and it would help the global economy cope with the pandemic, because it's quite obvious and it's apparent that to deal with a pandemic of the scale of COVID, we have to have much greater global cooperation, both economically and in terms of global public good. So this is health, but again, we knew this already from the challenges around the environment. But we're also doing it at a time of general discontent with the status quo. And we're also doing it at a time when there's great powers competition. So the tensions between the US and China means that it's harder to come up with, for instance, agreement on global rules or global actions. And that type of tension also points to itself a battle of ideas around the best economic system and the best approach. So within this context, I think it is probably worth thinking a bit about lessons from history as to what do you do, because this is not the first time there's been great powers competition, and it's certainly not the first time that there's been a breakdown in consensus around the importance of multilateralism. And it's certainly not the first time in which there's a breakdown in consensus as to the best economic system. And just to give you a sense of when I say a breakdown in consensus, in the early part of the 20th century, 40% of the world's population lived in communist regimes, and another 20% or so lived in at least partly socialized regimes. So that was when capitalism underwent its reforms and added the welfare state. And after World War II, the Bretton Woods institutions and the supranational institutions tried to develop a rules-based system with global cooperation around stability, reconstruction, and eventually trade. So all of that was born out of a discussion around what the best system ought to be. So we are again, of course, at this point, and the pandemic has shown us we do need to rebuild this consensus. Now, I should probably give the caveat of the Mark Twain quote before I draw the lessons to wrap up my introductory comments. So Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And the lessons we take from history, I think, should be taken in that vein. So to rebuild the economic consensus, which I write about, it requires a battle of ideas based on evidence-based proposals. So, the last battle of ideas that I pointed to, the economic battle of ideas between the different economic systems drew on the evidence of what was working, what was not. It also, secondly, requires a lot of public debate and engagement. So change doesn't come because of people in ivory towers with ideas. It comes because there's a public discourse about the best system that is best suited for the current circumstance. And so throughout the late Victorian period, throughout the early 20th century, throughout the Cold War, there was a lot of debate about multilateralism and the best system. And that is indeed what we need. Thirdly, it probably won't be a straight line. So as I mentioned, there was a time in which it seemed the non-market economy was gaining popularity around the world. But then eventually, with the reformed market system and the development of the global system as we know it today, we've settled briefly on a consensus. And then fourth and finally, it takes a lot of time. So if you did a rough calculation of what I'm describing, we're talking decades. It does take time to rebuild such a system. But I think it's possible, and I think it would help the global economy live with the virus if we could come to a new consensus about what works best for the 21st century for domestic economies and multilaterally.
Okay, Linda, thank you very much. That's excellent. What I want to do is first give a word of advice to those who are listening in. I'm going to split the rest of our time, which is just under half an hour, between a discussion between the panelists about their presentations, and then a discussion with the audience. So I'm very happy to gather up some questions to the panelists on the chat mechanism here on Zoom. If you send the messages on chat, I will then pick them up and read them out. I think that although it's fun to have everybody on screen, it's probably rather technologically challenging, and I think it'll be easier. So please send your messages on the chat screen. I want to come back to you for a moment, Linda, and just ask whether you're not being terribly over-optimistic that we can get a serious economic consensus forged again at a time when the geopolitical tensions are possibly as great as they've ever been. Not just the China-US tension as economic power shifts from west to east, but also the degree of nationalism that has inevitably been the response to what is primarily a health threat rather than an economic threat. And everybody seems to have tended to fall back on saying, we're going to do this ourselves, we're going to get our own vaccine, we're going to put up borders, we're going to impose quarantine. I mean, surely it's the worst possible moment to be looking for a consensus.
I think these are the moments in which the opportunity is greatest to look for consensus. If you look back over the sweep of history that I'm describing, it covers fascism, it covers communist revolutions, it covers hot wars as well as cold wars. And going back to the late Victorian period when the consensus broke down significantly around multilateralism, and that was because of just a very short dive into history. The Panic of 1873 essentially ignited the first modern global financial crisis. Unemployment appeared in the dictionary for the first time in 1888. There was, of course, the Gilded Age with huge levels of income inequality. And all of that led to people at the time preparing for a hot war. That was the revolution, the communist revolution that was being anticipated, which, by the way, did not happen in the last quarter of the 19th century. It happened in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution that created the Soviet Union. But what I'm pointing to is that every era has its own challenges. And the lesson from history is that we've gone through a lot before, and there's no telling what path we'll take now. But the lessons that I'm highlighting is that one can either despair or accept we are in a new era of great powers competition. So what can we do to form a consensus around the importance of global cooperation on global public goods like health and the environment, which are pressing priorities? And it won't be a straight line, it'll take time. But if we take any consolations from history, it can be done. It might just take a really long time.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Let me come back to you then, Iain. Do you buy that? Do you think that this is a moment when not only do we need to forge a new consensus, but we actually have a real opportunity to do so?
Well, there's two positive and one negative answer to that. The one negative one is that I fear we've only seen the beginning of the COVID pandemic. It's affected China initially. China dealt with it quite effectively. it was not so well dealt with in Western Europe and North America, and we're only seeing the early stages of its impact on emerging markets and the poorest countries in the world. So there's a danger that it continues for quite some time before we work out how to cope with it. The more positive things to think about is that COVID is likely to usher in rapidly accelerating structural change in a number of rather unexpected ways. For example, one reaction we're seeing in city economies is that the reluctance of many office workers to go back to work is meaning that the infrastructure beneath them, this has been qualified as the pret-a-manger economy, the sandwich bars, are going to struggle to survive. And if people are reluctant to go back into offices for reasons that go beyond the immediate threat of COVID, simply because they become used to working from home, that can be quite transformative. That will have downsides as well as upsides, but it's likely to mean a permanent shift. Similarly with leisure activities, if consumers are reluctant to do things, then they are not going to revert to the kind of economy we're used to. So there is a potential for rapid structural change, which we need to work on, and that's driven more by markets and individual decisions than it is by top-down government policies. The other more positive area is built into the European Recovery Plan, and that's to associate it very closely with the Green Deal, to try to transform the production processes and say a significant proportion of the new investment that's being put forward is going to be targeted towards green projects of different sorts. And you see that elsewhere as well. That could lead to an acceleration of the green revolution that we all seem to agree is necessary to avert climate change. But it does have a potential risk to it, which is that if you want the stimulus package to have an immediate impact on relaunching the economy, building new green facilities is not something that happens quickly enough. So there's a tension likely to arise there between trying to effect the change that so many seem to regard as desirable, while also dealing with the immediate problem of getting people back to work in economies that have been hard hit by the pandemic effects. So as I say, two positives with caveats and one negative.
Okay, so let's pursue the question of the Green Deal, or that this could be the shock combined with climate change that actually maybe pushes everybody to form a new consensus about dealing with climate change. Does that sound to you, Howard, as a possible way forward, that we may be still thinking too much about the economy in terms of rather traditional economic challenges, the inflation challenge, the fiscal austerity versus expansionism challenge, and that actually we really need to refocus so much of our economic thinking on a new green agenda? Do you buy that?
Well, I do up to a point, but, and here I'm going to be much less optimistic than Iain and Linda, as we recover or attempt to recover from this crisis, and because it was the same kind of thing for everybody, I mean, you could adopt some sort of rhetoric calling it a Chinese virus, but I don't think anyone was particularly fooled by that. This was a common problem. So it didn't need that much international collaboration. People were doing the same kinds of things. As you look at the economic impacts, people will try to find ways of trading their way out of it. And reducing their exchange rate will be one way. And having a situation where you have a US president who is a mercantilist is a rather dangerous position to start from, because people will suspect that the US will try to grow their way out of trouble at other people's expense. And then if you add on to that the climate change problem, the Green Deal all sounds great, and I am not by remotely a climate change denier. I mean, I think, I'm completely convinced of what we need to do. But I do note that the likelihood is that it increases your cost base, at least in the short run, because the energy is more expensive if you have to create it either with new nuclear power stations, look at the cost implications of that in the UK, or offshore. To start with, these new technologies increase your energy costs. And therefore, you potentially have a competitive disadvantage if other people aren't doing it. And at the moment, the Chinese are still building coal-fired power stations, very cheap electricity. So without any kind of international agreement on climate change and how we deal with it, that's going to be very difficult and is going to create significant tensions. Now, we've got COP26 coming up. Maybe that will produce agreements, but I foresee that the Green Deal, which sounds terrific, is nonetheless could be at the heart of significant conflicts internationally, bluntly, if not everybody is proceeding in the same direction at the same time.
Okay, and Linda, just come into that. Could I ask you to put it in terms of that wider global perspective? We're very focused on Europe inevitably, we're focused on America, but where would China fit into forging that new consensus? And China has actually done a tremendous amount, far more, I think, than people sometimes give China credit for, in tackling climate change. But do you think China's vision will be driven by a genuine desire to forge a global consensus, or more by the desire to restore Chinese power and pride?
I can't speak for China, but I think that when I describe this as an era of great powers competition, I think I'm essentially getting at what we're all we're mentioning different aspects of, which is, the United States emerged after the Cold War as the superpower and the economic superpower. But pretty shortly thereafter, and in fact, some of the World Bank data suggests it was even earlier in the 1980s. So China started to reform in the 1980s, that China had eventually begun to drive as much global growth as the United States since the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s to this day. So we are in an era in which you have two economic superpowers, but they're very different political systems. One's a democracy, one is not. And you have the adjustment process, which is always challenging. So thinking back in history to the last adjustment between great powers, which was the UK, and the, especially markedly in the interwar period, the dollar rising and replacing sterling as the reserve currency in the global system required quite a lot of global, certainly cooperation between the UK and the US in order to avoid, destabilizing the financial system. So I think those are some of the reasons why I think we have to keep our eyes open, that this is another era in which you have this power adjustment, and you have two great powers, and they have very different systems and goals and priorities and ambitions. And this is not an easy time to forge the kinds of multilateral, global, rules-based cooperation that's needed, for this reason. Climate is, I think, so the other thing I would stress is not, this is the general framework, but on different specific issues, there's different degrees of cooperation and different degrees of competition. So on climate, the US and China's history, has been, varied, is not the best word for it, appointing heads of multilateral organizations. They certainly come head to head quite a lot. So I think in this era, and this is part of the work we're doing on the LSE Commission on Economic Diplomacy, is in order to continue to work globally and cooperatively, being very issues-based rather than painting relationships with broad brushes is probably one of the ways to try and make progress on cooperation on agreeing global rules, because it is a challenging time when you're working between two economic superpowers.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. I want to ask one more question of you before I take the first question from the listeners and the audience. Howard, let me put a political question to you. Does it all depend very much in terms of future global cooperation on the result of the American election? Are we stuffed if Trump comes back and we'll triumph if Biden gets it? Or in fact, is it that the geopolitical trends, if you like, may very well still be reflected in a Biden administration as much as a Trump one?
Well, I certainly think there won't be a kind of sea change in every respect. But I would say that the Biden campaign seems to be arguing that they should move back towards a global consensus that, America needs to take its part in managing globalization. I think that would probably be something to which Biden would sign up, where it's not clear that this administration would sign up to that. So I think it would be a helpful move from that respect.
Okay. Now, I want to go to the first question that I've got here, and I've just lost it, from Federico Steinberg at Elcano. Federico asks, to what extent do you think the EU can start to deploy tools to develop its strategic, economic and technological autonomy? Do you think that it will come closer to being a traditional power that will enter competition with the US and China? Or will it remain using, how the hell do I move this without losing the whole thing? Will it remain using primarily its soft power? And for that, I'm going to come to you, Iain.
Hello, Federico. I hope things are going well in Madrid now. The dual answer to that is that Europe has an economic weight similar to both the US and China. It ought to be the third leg of the global economy and global governance. We know about the problems of fragmentation, but I sense a willingness to come together, not just to use soft power, but to go a bit beyond it. We do see Europe more these days saying to China, we're not so happy with the things you're doing. There is a pushback against the United States, particularly on things like extraterritorial sanctions. And with the narrative around the Green Deal, there is an opportunity for Europe using soft power mechanisms to say, here is the model we want to promote globally. But I think there is a litmus test coming. If I'm correct in saying that the spread of coronavirus effects has yet to hit the poorest countries in the world, there is going to be a major test for bodies like the IMF, whose role is to try to manage crises as they happen. So far, it's done okay, but it's not had to face the demands of many poor countries requiring bailouts or loans to be written off and programs. So the Europe will have to lead in ensuring that bodies like the IMF and perhaps a revived World Health Organization have the capacity to deal with these problems as they arise. If Europe passes that test, I can see it exercising a greater power and coming onto the same sort of plane as the two poles that we've been talking about, China and the US.
Okay, let me, Linda, can I come to you a little bit on the same thing? How do you see Europe, and essentially we're talking about the European Union, no longer including the United Kingdom, how do you see Europe actually playing a leadership role when really the really big elephants are the US and China?
I agree with what Iain has said. I think the EU is the world's biggest economic bloc. And I think one of the ways to manage, is that the right word, in an era of great powers, is to play an honest broker type of role. So for instance, if the US suggests something, China is likely to veto it, which is roughly what happened with the acting DG of the WTO. If China were to suggest something, the US would probably look askance. So having non-economic superpowers play this role is actually quite important. And in fact, if you look at the pluralistic approaches of countries trying to push forward on certain global issues, whether it's data liberalization or services trade liberalization, there's quite a bit of this need for pluralistic approaches rather than a consensus. And Europe can play a huge part in that, being major economies, advanced economies. The bloc as a whole was a huge market. And again, the approach would be to try and get as much buy-in so that you can have a set of norms or rules or standards that enough countries support, and then you would hope the US and China come on board because they view it as global and not the product of one system or another. But that's very difficult. I'll give you an example of how difficult it is on data, just as an illustration. And this is a gross simplification. This is something that a data expert had mentioned to me, which is if you think about how important data is, what is the standard on data? So roughly speaking, in China, the government owns your data. In the United States, corporations own your data. In Europe, you own your data. So how in the world are you going to find a universal agreement on data when you stem from such different places? And so this is where I think Europe can play a role, where I think all economies have to think about ways of managing in an era of great powers. And having a multilateral approach or pluralistic approach that becomes multilateral would be welcome, but hard, like the data example I just gave.
Okay, let me put this to you, and maybe I'll start with you, Howard, but I don't know if the others would like to come in, and you may say, look, it's a ridiculously superficial question. But at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a serious suggestion that actually the more authoritarian countries were going to be much better at dealing with this than the liberal democracies. That in fact, they would lay down the rules and they could stop people traveling around and so on much more effectively. As the crisis has developed, it really does look as if the authoritarian countries have not been doing so well, at least as far as Russia or Brazil is concerned, that the more committed liberal democracies who've engaged their populations, take Germany, take others possibly with women in leadership roles like New Zealand, have done much better. Now, am I being incredibly superficial, or do you think there's something in there? Howard, would you like to pick that one up?
If I jump in very quickly, Quentin, there, and say, okay. Where do you situate the US in your taxonomy?
A sort of incompetent authoritarian is sitting in the White House.
Well, I find it quite difficult to put to support that hypothesis, really, because if you look at the way in which different countries have behaved and the incidence of it, I think we're still at too early a stage to know who can be said to have been successful and who not. I mean, one measure appears to be, the intensity of lockdown, and there's an Oxford University sort of measure of that, versus excess deaths. On that, the UK appears to be the worst on the planet. And I don't know what that tells you. I'm not quite sure. We can't really be described as an authoritarian country. But on the other hand, we do have a rather complicated set of responsibilities in the UK, as we've discovered with the devolved administrations. So I honestly think it's probably too early to produce any conclusions and correlate them with types of government. I'd be happy to be corrected, but I personally, when I look at the data, I find it difficult to see any real rhyme or reason in it.
But earlier on, you did underline your doubts about leadership on the European front, perhaps, and that leadership may be the bigger question rather than whether it's authoritarian leadership or liberal democratic leadership.
Well, I do, and I think, health is not really my expertise, but So taking it back to what I do know a certain amount about, and that is the sort of management of the global financial system. I mean, one simple point that I would make, which causes me to be a bit skeptical about European leadership, is that it is still the case that in the key areas, the IMF being one, but particularly things like the Basel Committee, does Europe speak with one voice in those? No, it does not. You still have individual member states plus the European Commission and the ECB. If Europe was serious about taking a leadership role in the management of the global financial system, we would have a European representative holding the shareholding in the IMF. We would have the ECB and probably and the Commission, since they're the lawmaker in this, at the Basel Committee, and we wouldn't have a separate Frenchman and a separate German and a separate Italian, whoever. And those would be important signals which the rest of the world would pay some attention to, that actually they have to deal with Europe. At the moment, they don't see that. They see that actually they're all represented in different ways and all take different points of view, and that's not particularly helpful or constructive in my view.
Okay, Iain, let me put that to you. Is that a fair cop? Is there a serious lack of leadership? And where does the United Kingdom fit in this? Are we showing a sort of any inspiration to be global Britain that will show the way forward? Can we decide what the hell we want?
Well, don't forget, Quentin, I'm a Scot, so I have to have a distinctive approach to this. The European leadership is a mixed bag. Howard is entirely right that in some of the things like international finance, you see incoherence. But I think European leadership is very strong on the green arena. We saw it in previous COPs going back to Copenhagen, even though in the end it was the Chinese and the Americans who had to get together to have a tentative deal. The European position has been very strong on it and has continued to provide a model for the rest of the world. So there are areas where Europe is coherent. I also happen to think that this agreement that's just been reached a couple of months ago on the European recovery package does represent maybe not quite a Hamiltonian moment, but a moment where Europe moves to a different approach to economic governance, where it's accepted that the European level should do something. And as I recalled earlier, Europe being a member in its own right, the European Union being a member in its own right of the G20, is in a position to exercise collective power as well as the power of the 4 individual members who are in the G20. So there's an opportunity. Whether we take that opportunity, I'm speaking as a European now rather than a Brit, remains to be seen. And I think it's just unfortunate that Britain seems to be on this course not just of Brexit, but also a rather antagonistic Brexit that means it's not going to have the voice, collective voice, that it might have if it were even party to many of these European initiatives, despite being outside the EU. So I rather fear that Britain is not going to be influential in this in the way I'd like it to be.
Okay, last word to Linda, and then, because I fear we must conclude. Linda, if you look at the world today, at the whole global picture, the world in which you would like to see a new economic consensus formed, who's going to give that leadership? Where are you going to get it from?
It sounds, a bit...
I've lost you.
And probably under society. It has to come from all segments of society, and that is a lesson from history. So thinking back to the late Victorian period again, when there was a backlash against globalization, against capitalism, it wasn't just economists writing their manuscripts. It was making those pieces of ideas and the evidence accessible, and for grassroots community level, for really everyone to engage in it and say, no, I don't think that is the system in which I wish to live. So, that is how ultimately a new consensus comes about. There's been a few, more than a few, but there's a few recent books which actually looks at how quickly you can change, for instance, social attitudes. So even though we may see it and think, oh, doesn't feel neat, how would this work? A lot of the dramatic changes in attitude we've seen over the past few decades have come about because the consensus has started to change around what is the environment, for instance, is actually one of those examples. And so you can, I think, have broad engagement. I think you can focus on how the reform should be, and then try and forge a consensus. And in this topic that we're talking about, multilateralism, the leadership does have to come from countries forging this multilateral system. But what I'm describing as the issues-based, pluralistic, network-based, focus on very technical issues. So in Howard's area, financial regulation, for instance, in other areas, data, that requires the private sector who actually have the expertise. And it also requires involvement by communities and by consumer watch groups and by trade unions, because the perspectives that they bring to that is ultimately one that is valued and is needed. And I think that's going to be the process I would like to see in the 21st century, which technology actually makes possible in a way that perhaps it wasn't before. So I don't know how we're going to end up in this century. All I do know is it's a very challenging time. It's not great to be in an era of great powers competition, but it also, I think, offers opportunities to begin to address some of the fundamental issues in this market-based economy, to reform it, or risk losing it to an alternative system. But we should never be under any illusion that somehow what's worked in the past ought to work today. Everything needs to change. What's that saying? If you don't change or move, standing still means you're falling behind. And I think that's true for economics as it is for everything else. So I'm optimistic. So I'm a very unusual economist. I'm not really a dismal science type of person, but I think we can learn from history, and we can make a better system going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Linda, for leaving us with a rather more upbeat message. It's quite difficult to do that. I would have enjoyed having a few waspish words from Ralph Dahrendorf in our conversation as well. Somebody who actually positively welcomed, I think, the sort of conflict and of dispute and debate. And we've held this debate, I hope, a little bit in his memory. Thank you all very much. Thank you for everybody who's been listening in. I hope I didn't miss any other questions, but on my chat thing, I didn't see any. I hope you've enjoyed the debate. So thank you very much, and tune in next week, same time, same Zoom, to the final one of the series. So thank you very much, and thanks to the Dahrendorf Forum.